Well, it's great to be with you this weekend, and today we wrap up our series, When Pigs Fly, and we're talking about the miracles of Jesus. We've been studying several miracles throughout the Gospels, and I'm so excited to hear what God is doing in our church family, our community. There's been lots of stories of how God's been doing some miracles in your life. In fact, I got an email from a congregant this week, and here's the opening line of her email. She said this, listen to this. She said, "My boss has been on me since before she became my boss." Now, isn't that great? My boss has been on me since before she has been my boss. And so she cited a couple things where her boss has just been all over, has thrown her under the bus, her and her coworkers, has really taken some credit for work that her and her coworkers have done. And she's been an apple polisher and a butt kisser. In fact, that's what she wrote in the email, butt kisser. I love when congregants can be really open about their life situations and what's going on. And so she said, here's what I did. I found somebody from our church and I began to pray with them. That's why it's important to have friends in church. Get into a small group, get to know somebody, because it's great to sit in the row, but you need support at times. And so she said, I reached out to a friend and we began praying. And I was praying for God. I was asking for a miracle. Now you would think that the miracle would be, why don't you change my boss, God? Here's my agenda. I got a couple things that you could really just start shaping within her heart. And rather than doing that though, she committed to praying for a month, and all she prayed about was her own heart. Said, God, would you change my heart? God, would you help me? Would you forgive me of my bitterness and some of my anger toward my boss? In fact, she said this, I made a commitment, Adam, to make sure that I was going to speak life. I was going to speak words that were positive. I was going to build my boss up. And then recently, she got a gift from her boss, and here's the gift. Check this out. This is really cool. She got this gift. It's of a cross. This is kind of like a psychedelic version of a cross, but nonetheless, she got a cross, and at the bottom of the cross, it says this, I believe in miracles. How many of you believe in miracles? I believe in miracles. And this woman got this gift, this cross from her boss. She has no idea. She didn't know. Maybe she's a Christ follower, but she got this gift and a little note, and it said, you know what? You've been so great at connecting with people here in the office. Now, why do I tell you that story? I tell you that story for this reason. Sometimes we're waiting on God to do a miracle. Sometimes you're asking, just like I am, God, would you move in this situation? But maybe, just maybe, the miracle is waiting on you. Maybe, just maybe, that God is waiting on you to prepare your heart and say, God, I have some things going on inside of me, and rather than praying for the miracle that's external, God, I want to pray internally and prepare my heart for what you want to do so that the miracle outside of me can start on the inside of me. All right, so that's good, isn't it? That's, man, I heard that, I saw that story, and I thought, man, what an incredible story. Well, today we're wrapping up in part 4 of this series, and I want to begin with a phrase that most of you know. The phrase is the GOAT. The GOAT. Now, if you don't know what the phrase the GOAT means, it means this, the greatest of all time, the greatest of all time. And when I say that phrase, growing up, I thought of one person, this guy right here. I thought of number 23, Michael Jordan. I thought of MJ. He was the GOAT. In fact, when I think of Michael Jordan, here's what I think of. I think of 6 NBA championships. He hoisted 6 championships in the 90s. In fact, he'd have probably won more championships, except that his dad was violently murdered, and in order to fulfill a dream of his dad, he switched professional sports and played baseball for the Chicago White Sox. Now, just think about that for a moment. You know what? I'm going to give this up and go play another professional sport. He's the greatest of all time. I think of the movie. Do you remember the movie Space Jam? Remember that movie? Come on, sing it with me. I believe I can fly. I believe, oh, somebody's raising their hand. I believe I can touch, watch out, right? Right, you remember that? Or do you remember this? Don't you remember the tongue? MJ's tongue, when the tongue came out, good luck. You had kids all over every basketball court going like, we were trying to dunk the ball. We could only jump like 3 inches off the ground. And yet that's some of the things that I remember. You know what I remember also? I think of the marketing phenomena that blew up in the 90s around Michael Jordan. I think of the Jumpman logo. I think of Gatorade and Hanes. I mean, Hanes underwear. You had a whole generation of little boys jumping out of cartoon underwear into whitey tighties because Mike, we want to be like Mike. He's wearing them, we're wearing them. Like we all wanted to, it was a phenomena. I remember all of the remember the shoes, the J's, everybody wanted a pair of J's. Man, if you had a pair of Jordans, it was like incredible. And all of this was triggered by one iconic image, by one dunk that he did in 1988. Remember this dunk? Here it is. That's Jordan flying in the air 15 feet. From foul line to rim. Now, I don't know what you would attribute that to. Maybe some of you are coaches today, you're athletes, you understand sports and dynamics. Can you imagine? To me, that was miraculous. When he took off, it was like, oh my word. Now just to put this in the context, do you know what 15 feet is? Listen, MJ is 6'6", I'm 6'3". 15 feet is this. It's from right here, I measured it this morning, right here to over here. He jumped 15 feet in the air and dunked the ball 10 feet high. Can you imagine what that must have been like? Now, there are a lot of people who are the greatest of all time. Maybe in your generation it was somebody else. A lot of iconic names, people in all different arenas in life, whether it's entertainment or business or whatever it looks like. There's also some great names when it comes to the Bible. People like Joseph, or people like Esther, people like Daniel, or if you look at the New Testament, like Barnabas or Lydia. I mean, there are so many different people, but the greatest of all time in the Bible is a man. And this man was a good man. He was a great man. And he died a death, a very hard death, out of love, a great love for you and for me. And his name is Jesus. He died on the cross. It's amazing that we say the cross. It shows the significance of how he died, because we never say the knife, the gallows, the noose. But every time we say the cross, we know who hung on the cross, don't we? We know that Jesus Christ hung on the cross. And while MJ's influence soared because he was known as Air Jordan, the influence of Jesus Christ took on totally different meaning because he was dying. He died a death on the cross. No one disputes this. Josephus, a first century historian, worked for the Romans, wrote about this. Tacitus was just very graphic in the execution of Jesus on the cross. In fact, I heard an atheist just this week from Vanderbilt. No one denies the fact that Jesus was executed on the cross. It was on the cross where really, you talk about pull, you talk about influence. The influence of Jesus Christ when he died on the cross divides time, doesn't it? Those who were born before him and after him. Now, death isn't unusual to us. In fact, 2 people die every second. 105 every minute, 56 million people die every single hour. But there is one death that changed human history. There's one death that has so much power and meaning for you and me. So what I want to do in the next few moments, I want to revisit the scene, and I want you to reimagine the cross, the sight and the sound of the cross together. I'm going to read a lengthy portion from the Gospel of Matthew, and I just want you to sit. I want you to experience the cross, the greatest miracle, with me today. Mark chapter 15, beginning in verse 16, says this. Read these words. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, and then they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again and again, they struck him on the head with a staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. And then they led him out to crucify him. Now, a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha. It was the place of the skull. They offered him wine that was mixed with myrrh. It was a natural sedative. It was a painkiller. But he did not take it. And they crucified him. They crucified him. Dividing up his clothes. They cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, So you're going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Come down from the cross and save yourself. In the same way, there were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the chief priests, who mocked him among themselves. He saved others. They muttered under their breath, he saved others. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. And those who crucified with him also heaped insults on him. The rebels, they were heaping insults on him. Now at noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. For 3 hours, darkness. And at that time in the afternoon, and at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice this phrase that is translated, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A good man who died a death, a hard death, out of love, great love for you and me. They crucified him, and he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Now, in the silence of the cross, I wonder what is stirring in your head and in your heart. That this man willfully laid down his life, the perfect picture of self-sacrifice and forgiveness for all of humanity. I wonder what is stirring inside of you. I don't know what it is, but I do know what the Apostle Paul said some 25, 30 years after the cross. In fact, he writes to a little upstart church in Corinth, and here are his words in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. He writes this, he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." Now, Paul has a key insight. What he does with the cross is, he says the cross is the power of God, and it divides all of humanity into 2 groups. He says there are those who are perishing, they're moving away from the cross, and those who are being saved because they're responding to the power of God through the cross, the miracle of the cross. God at work where suffering and sin and death and God met to ransom and to give us power for life and life eternally. It's the greatest miracle that has ever taken place. But the greatest man in human history, his name is Jesus Christ. In fact, he did this on his own accord, out of his own volition. He decided to lay his life down. No one made that decision except for the Father, in which he was obedient to. In fact, here are his words in John chapter 10. He says this, Jesus says, "No one takes it from me, my life, but I lay it down out of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father." So with the time that remains today, what I want to do is I want us to reimagine the power of the cross. I know many of us are longtime followers of Jesus. You know Jesus, but sometimes, I don't know if you're like me, but it is so easy to miss the glory and the power and the wonder of the cross. We talk about miracles like we've been studying in this series, When Pigs Fly. We've been talking about how God sets us free and delivers us. A couple weeks ago, Chris looked at the demoniac in Mark chapter 2, did a fantastic job. who we talked about 2 weeks ago when Gary spoke of healing and how God healed in John chapter 5 an invalid, a paralytic, for 38 years because he couldn't get to the pool. Last week, I shared out of John chapter 6. We looked how God provided for 5,000 people through one little boy's lunch. And yet the power of the cross is this, because what Jesus did for one in his earthly ministry on the cross, on the death on the cross, he did for all of us. See, what he did for one, he did for all on the cross. There is freedom and there is healing and there is provision on the cross. So the power of the cross is simply this, that we don't simply observe the cross historically, in history. We have the opportunity to live his story through his death on the cross. So there's three things that the cross gives us power for. The first is this. In the cross, Jesus' blood gives us freedom. In the cross, Jesus' blood gives us freedom. And so you ask, what freedom from what? Freedom from sin and guilt and shame. Freedom from all of the mess that runs rampant inside of you and me. It's easy for us to look at our world today and to critique and to criticize and to be a cynic and say, this is so broken in our educational system. And while it's all true, there's a lot of social ills, there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of mess. If we were real with ourselves, there's a lot of mess and brokenness inside of me and inside of you, isn't there? There's a lot of things that want to bind us and hold us and to chain us down. There are lots of thoughts and lots of insecurities and lots of fears and lots of things that hold you inside and lock you up. Just like the demoniac in Mark chapter 2, bound in chains in the cemetery. How many ever felt like you've just walked around a cemetery? You're a walking dead person. And see, on the cross, the blood of Christ gives us freedom. On the cross, God is doing something. Oh, he's so brilliant. God is up to something. He's switching stuff and he's doing stuff. In fact, 2 Corinthians says this. 2 Corinthians 5 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us so that we could become the righteousness of God. What God was doing on the cross was he was saying to his son, you're going to become sin. Jesus became without committing the act. Jesus became a liar without lying. Jesus became an adulterer without committing adultery. Jesus took on and bore every sin, every despicable act, every shameful thing, envy and deceit. He took it all on the cross and he said, you know what? I am going to be an atonement. I'm going to be an offering for all of humanity's sin. And when we place our faith and our hope and our confidence in the work of the cross, then we have freedom. Because what Jesus did for one, he did for all. And if the cross doesn't cover everything, then the cross means nothing. And yet through the cross of Christ, you and I, we have freedom. We have freedom from our sin and our shame. That's why Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, he says, therefore now there is no condemnation. I know we have some lawyers that come. I know there's at least one judge in our congregation. How many of you know, help me, how many of you know that a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime? Am I right? That's right. Can't be tried twice for the same crime. So if Jesus is the picture of my sin and the picture of your sin, while he didn't actually commit the sin, he served as the offering. And from a judicial standpoint, when God judged Jesus on the cross, he judged your sin and my sin on the cross so that when we sin, there is freedom and forgiveness and we're not judged by God. Jesus took that on the cross. And now we have freedom. And you might not like what I've done, and you might not like what other people have done when it comes to their sin. Sometimes we look around and we say, oh man, I can't believe, really? I can't believe that God would die for them. Maybe you're here today and say, Adam, I have sinned so much. There are things in my life that are so despicable, I would never want them known by anybody else. I want you to know that God knows, and I want you to know that Christ died for your sin, for everyone's sin. God is for all people. If Christ didn't die for everyone, then we couldn't preach the gospel to all people. And yet the gospel is for everyone. God is for everyone through the cross. It's where we find freedom. You know who knew this really well? The Apostle Peter. You know, everybody on the day when Jesus was crucified, everybody was guilty. Pilate was guilty of injustice, and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law were guilty of envy, and the soldiers and the thieves, they were guilty of mockery, and the disciples were guilty of denial and betrayal. Remember Peter? He denied Christ right before his crucifixion 3 different occasions. He was guilty, 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 guilty. Have you ever been pulled over by a police officer and you look in the rearview mirror and you see the red lights flashing and you think to yourself, oh man, busted. Do you know that feeling? Do you know what that's like, right? And you ever feel like when they say to you, do you know what you were doing? You're like, no, I don't know, but you do. That's your job. Tell me and I'll pay the ticket, right? Because you know you're guilty, guilty, guilty. This is exactly what Peter was experiencing. After Jesus predicted the fact that he was not only going to deny him, but when he heard the rooster crow on the 3rd time, then Peter's guilt was squared him up right in front of his face. And Peter wrote these words years later. He said this in 1 Peter. He said in 1 Peter chapter 2, when they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. And here's his quotation that he reaches back to the prophet Isaiah 53, and he says this, by his wounds we are healed. Peter knew the wounds of betrayal and heartache that Jesus healed. Just like when Jesus healed that invalid in John chapter 5, for 38 years, he couldn't make it to the pool. He couldn't receive a miracle. More than the miracle itself to stand up and walk, do you know what the miracle pointed to? A sign that's below the actual physical healing. It was the healing of his broken heart. Can you imagine trying to get to the place where you can receive a miracle, trying to get there, and every single year somebody would cut you off and get into the pool and you missed your healing? There's a broken heart there. There's anger and frustration. There is even resentment, dare I say, to God to say, God, why wouldn't you heal me? God, why wouldn't you clear the way? Why couldn't I do this? At the cross, there is healing. And the greatest healing that can ever take place, listen to me on this, is the healing of the human heart. You can receive a physical healing, an emotional healing, a financial healing, but if you don't allow yourself, your heart to be healed from the power of God through the cross, then you've missed the greatest miracle. Comes at the cross. The final thing that the cross, the power of the cross does for us, through the cross we find provision. We find provision. Provision for what? For this life. I don't know about you, but I can't do this life without God. I can't. I can't. A lot of people try to do life without God, and every single time my experience is that their life, they end up in a ditch. They end up with wounds and scars that are so painful, they don't know how to reconcile them in their family. They don't know what to do with the God question. Everything just, they don't have any provision beyond their own limitations. And what God wants to do, what he did on the cross is he gives us access to the Spirit of God, which provides for us. In terms of our character, in terms of our perspective. Paul talks about this in Galatians. He says in Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. How graphic. Can you imagine what Paul is saying? That when they hung him high and spread him wide, I was there with Jesus on the cross. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live. Can you imagine the deep faith when we can say to God, God, I don't want to live my life my way through my strength. I am living through you. I've been crucified with you. He says, but Christ lives in me. The best life that you can live is the life that Christ lives in you. Friends, the best thing that you can do is allow the grace and the power of God through the cross of Christ to live through you. That he would bear fruit inside of you: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. That's only because the power of Christ lives in you. You can't read about it, white knuckle it. You can't generate the kind of strength to change you. Only the power of God through the cross does that. It's the provision we need. It's the provision to go out into our world today where it's broken and dark, where it's cynical, where it's critical, where people who are blinded. Listen, people aren't bad, friends. Listen, your boss isn't bad. Your spouse isn't bad. People aren't bad. They're blinded. In fact, Paul says they're blinded by the God of this age, by the enemy himself. They're blinded and they're broken. And the way that you fight blindedness and brokenness is through an outside power through your life. That's why Jesus says you're salt and you're light. Light for what? So that people can see. Salt for what? So that people, they can taste again. They can taste the full flavors of God. In what? In your life. That's only through the power of God. There was a good man who died a death, a very hard death, out of a love, a great love for you. Today, I want to challenge you to renew your commitment. It's the power of God, the cross of Christ. In a moment, we're going to have an opportunity to listen to a song. The song is going to serve as a process piece. That means you're going to process something. And earlier I told you, you can't get to the place of the cross and view the cross without a response to the cross. And I'm talking a response of every single person in this place today. Because the greatest miracle is the cross. It's where Jesus laid his life down for you. And if you didn't catch anything, if this wasn't simple, if I didn't do a good job explaining this, I want to make it as simple as possible. When we place our life and our confidence and our hope in the cross, all we do is admit that we're sinners, can't live this life. We believe all the miracles, as I told you last week, John says, all the miracles were written so that you would believe. And there wasn't enough books in the world to contain all of Jesus' miracles. To simply believe and then to confess. God, I confess that I'm weak without you. I can't do it without you. It's simple as A, B, C. Now, I want you to know that everything that I'm preaching today is what I'm currently living in my own life. I need Jesus. I need the power of the cross for me. You knew things that were going on in my mind, thoughts of fear and insecurity. Oh man. Last several weeks and months have been some of the most challenging times for me as a leader, as a human being, as a husband and a father. I need freedom. I need healing. Yeah, my eyes, yeah, I need healing. But I want to keep my heart tender before the Lord, trusting that God would bring healing to my eyes. I said something in a meeting. I didn't share this first service. We were in a circle. We were in a staff meeting, and it just came out. It was one of those moments where I was really drawing on the power of Jesus. And I was just declaring, listen, friends, sometimes you just got to declare things. You just have to have a confidence to declare. And it just kind of came out of me because I was praying and I was asking God, would you heal me? I believe that you are healing me, that it's going to be kind of a progressive thing. But there have been moments where I've been scared, where I've looked up and you can't see anything and your kids go off and life keeps happening and you wonder like, okay. And I got to this place, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks ago, and I was in a meeting. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I said something about, it was like a faith-filled statement. And I said, even if God doesn't heal my eyes, then I just live another 40 years and I die and I go be with him and then I'll be healed in heaven. And one of my staff members was like, woo, amen. And I said it and I was like, okay, God, but I would love for you to heal me in the next 40 years. But really, even if he doesn't, I have such a great life in him. Like, even if he chooses not to in this life, I know he will in the next life because of the cross. That's my hope. That's my confidence. And provision, oh my word. I'm trusting that God would provide for me. See, at the cross, there's an exchange, a great exchange. An exchange of your bondage and your brokenness and your limitations for God's freedom and his healing and his provision, his abundance. There was a good man who died a death, a very hard death, out of love, a great love for you.